Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Dalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And what a news there was this week. Military exercises finally ended around the island of Taiwan by the Chinese, but the fallout of what happened in the past week will be with us, not just now, but I think for weeks and months to come. So we'll talk about that. We have elections in Kenya, which are raising new questions about the degree to which democracy may be under threat, not only in Kenya, but frankly, in other parts of the world. And we'll talk a little bit about that. If we have some time, we may jump into Afghanistan. But for now, the big story is the fallout from Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and how the Chinese have reacted to it. Joining us this week to be part of that conversation, Nirmal Ghosh, who is the Washington bureau chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal is in Washington. Great to have you back.
Thank you, Ivo, and hello, everyone.
And from Wiltshire in the United Kingdom, James Harding, founder and co-editor in chief of Tortoise Media. James, great to have you back.
Thanks, Ivo.
And from New York, at the last minute, was able to join us because we have a COVID problem with one of our other guests is Emily Feng, who is the NPR Beijing correspondent. Emily happens to be in the United States. Great to have you. Wonderful to that you were able to join us, particularly on such short notice.
Thanks for bringing me in.
Nirmal, let's start with you. Just sort of bring us up to date. Nancy Pelosi, of course, visited Taiwan last week. And the Chinese reacted with military fury, I think is the right way to think about it. One, first, why did she go to Taiwan? And two, what was sort of the implication for what was happening in a region that, of course, you know well?
Yeah, so perhaps start with Southeast Asia. Across Southeast Asia, there's an almost universal feeling that her trip, the speaker's trip, was unnecessarily provocative. It raised the risks for Southeast Asia, which has to coexist with China, rely on China for trade, development, finance, but also stand up to China. But Beijing now is going to be more assertive, not less after this. So this trip has left the region more concerned at the path these two powers are on. And for very good reason. You have China, and I'm sure Emily can enlighten us a little more on that, but you have China believing absolutely that the United States is, one, trying to contain it, and two, slowly eroding or chipping away at the one China policy in reality. And the status quo has shifted. I believe the Chinese military's drills could now more regularly go over the median line. So China is changing the status quo like it did previously in the South China Sea, around the Senkakus and the Indian border in 2020. And the red lines are getting sharper, and the US military, I think, is still going to sail through the Taiwan Strait, which just a few months ago, China, by the way, said was its internal waters, China's internal waters. So we could see an eyeball-to-eyeball situation in the Taiwan Strait. Now, the US, of course, has been saying this is business as usual, nothing to see here, the visit, and maintains that China overreacted. But, I mean, this was predicted by everybody. How could China not react when the stakes are as high as Taiwan? And once it reacts, it can't be half-baked. I mean, this is China, and Taiwan is a core issue. So there had to be some reaction. It was predictable. And the intent clearly was intimidatory, the military exercises, the missiles, and so forth. But this has also seemingly served to harden resolve a bit in the US on the issue of Taiwan. And this now raises real-world questions on how this is going to be managed. Will the US, for example, actually defend Taiwan is, of course, the big question. But what will it do short of that? It'll give Taiwan more weapons. Taiwan also now, for Taiwan, things have gotten more real. It is still unlikely that there is going to be a war. That's the general consensus that I detect. But short of this, this has become much more edgy, more dangerous. China is sending strong signals. I, for one, worry that both China and the US may be underestimating each other. And across the board, unfortunately, cooperation and competition was supposed to be the way, but that's out of the window. It's all competition. They will not even talk about climate change, it seems. So we are not in a good place in the short or long term. It's become a distrustful and toxic relationship. And again, while China does not want a war, it does want to be taken seriously. And so for that matter, does the United States. So this has become, unfortunately, the litmus test in Northeast Asia. And many in the region and here as well in DC are saying, look, we need restraint, we need communication, we need restraint. And that doesn't mean appeasing China. It is just practical. And the same, of course, applies to China. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. I think Nirmal, that gives a good overview. Emily, let me ask you, since you know the thinking in Beijing so well, how do you explain to us how, frankly, a visitor of a politician to the island, to Speaker, which by the way happened 25 years ago when Speaker Gingrich went to Taiwan, that it led to the reaction, military, economic, and political, cutting off talks with the United States on climate change, on counter narcotics, on economic issues. Why the veracity of the response by the Chinese, or were they just looking for an excuse to move in this direction? How should we think about what the Chinese thinking is?
That's a good question. It had been a buildup. It was not just this visit, obviously, that sparked China to do what it had done, but there had been tensions created by both sides, not just China, not just the US, but both countries for the last basically 4 years, that had created an atmosphere of distrust that led China to interpret House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit as an escalation and kind of officially recognizing Taiwan as its own diplomatic entity. And that, of course, is the crux of the issue that China has with the existence of Taiwan, that it's not so much that China sees Taiwan as a renegade province, but that the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, Beijing, have been dueling for the last 70 years or so over who gets to represent China as a nation state. And so if the third in the line of command in the US goes and visits Taiwan, then it seems to bestow kind of like a quasi recognition that Taiwan is this sovereign entity that gets direct relations with the US, and thus in some way is kind of representing Chinese civilization on the world stage. And so that's why China reacted so vociferously. You mentioned 25 years ago in 1997, then Speaker Newt Gingrich went, why not the big reaction then? Well, keep in mind that this was basically just over a year after the third Taiwan Strait crisis. So the US and China had already kind of had this outlet to express their dissatisfaction and tension about this geopolitical arrangement. And it had gotten really, really bad. China was firing missiles towards Taiwan over the strait. There were routine shelling going back and forth between Taiwan and China. And China ultimately had to back down because the US sent at least one naval carrier in the direction of Taiwan. China just didn't have the military strength to match what then was US naval capacity. So it wasn't going to go head to head again over Newt Gingrich's visit. It's much different now that Speaker Pelosi has gone, because China has spent a lot of money and time upgrading its military. And it already was iffy about the US-China relationship for a whole host of reasons that I'm sure we're all broadly aware of. And so it was not so much that they were looking for an opportunity to air that dissatisfaction, but that these events had created an atmosphere in which China was much more willing to interpret this visit in much more serious terms, but also didn't give itself much room to back down as well. And that was unfortunate because it seemed like both sides were signaling that they didn't want any kind of conflict. As Nirmal mentioned, I don't think war is inevitable or just around the corner, but they also hadn't, particularly China, given themselves any possibility of doing anything other than military drills.
This is really fascinating. I want to come back to that in a minute, particularly this question of whether China now has concluded that the United States has given up on the one China policy, which I think is part of what's happening potentially, or certainly in terms of how they interpreted the Pelosi visit. But James, to you, the rest of the world, we talked about the Southeast Asians, they didn't like this visit. Not too many people thought this was the right time to have another crisis. How was the interpretation, how was the visit seen and the Chinese reaction seen from London and Brussels in some ways? How do they look at it?
So I'll come to that in 1 second. I was the Financial Times correspondent in Shanghai when Gingrich went to Taiwan, and I remember those shellings that Emily just described. And the one thing I'd say, as well as the big difference, Emily, obviously, in China's military capability in the last 25 years, is in its capacity for non-military retaliation. Because one of the questions I think that was raised by Speaker Pelosi's visit is, for many people, how real is the possibility of a Chinese military invasion? And whenever you speak to people and they explain to you how difficult and how costly that would be in Chinese lives on both sides, you come to, I think, the sensible conclusion that it's much harder to do than people, and in fact, many people who warn of it in either Beijing or Washington. What has changed, and this is one of the reasons why I think it played so badly in Brussels and capitals in Europe, is that what has changed is China's capacity for non-military retaliation that has a global impact. So we're 3 months away from the next COP. Suddenly you think to yourself, well, what realistic prospect is there of any momentum around climate cooperation? Frankly, people don't have much hope for this COP as it stands, but this is a real problem. And for the Europeans, they view everything at the moment through the prism of Ukraine. And so on the one hand, I've been concerned that Putin's action is a blueprint for what Xi Jinping might want to do unilaterally. But most immediately, there's an energy crisis. And further disruption caused to the Taiwan Straits and to shipping really concerns the Europeans, because the economic disruption and the household cost of that is real. So as well as the principal points that Nirmal and Emily were making about something that was incendiary within the context of China and Taiwan, for the Europeans, this was a real impact on households and household budgets.
Although, Emily, in some ways, the economic retaliation from the Chinese was limited. Yes, there were a bunch of products banned from Taiwan to be imported into China. But the big steps that China could take economically, they didn't, in part because the interaction and the interdependence between the Taiwanese and the Chinese economy is such that taking significant economic steps will hurt Beijing as much as it possibly could hurt Taipei. Is that right, or is it just there are more steps on the escalation ladder that they are keeping open for down the road if the conflict continues to escalate?
It's possible that they're saving them as further chips to play, but the vast majority of Taiwanese imports to China would be in semiconductors. And so that's just not something that China is able to wean itself off of immediately, and would actually hurt its own military if it decided that it was going to cut off its own access to the most advanced semiconductor chips that are made only in Taiwan, despite some manufacturers setting up some factories in China. But also the Taiwanese are kind of used to the economic threat. Sure, there are definitely some holdouts, particularly in eastern coastal regions that export a lot of seafood and agricultural products to China, and those tend to be more pro-Chinese, so to speak, in Taiwan. But the economic coercion element is something that I think Taiwanese citizens are very aware of, that they've been subject to in waves over the last couple of decades. And Taiwan itself has, the DPP, the current ruling party, has said many times that we are pursuing a kind of a Southeast Asian focus now in terms of building up exports, because we know that reliance on China is not secure.
Nirmal, how does the region view this? There are sort of two questions. One, the economic dimension of the relationship. Much of Southeast Asia is dependent, economically on China, interdependent. Anything that disrupts the relationship and the economic relationship is bad. But secondly, also this question of how Taiwan is viewed. This diplomatic dance, this idea that we have two representatives of the real China, and we kind of really don't want to confront the reality that they're two separate places. How does a Singapore or an Indonesia or a Thailand look at the issue, the fundamental issue of one China versus not only two systems, but frankly, two entities that are different and separate.
Yeah, well, I think they're quite comfortable and happy with the status quo as it obtains prior to. Of course, we've had these crises as we've been talking about 1996 and so forth, and now this could be the next one. It looks like it could be the next one. But they're quite comfortable with dealing with these two entities, and as you said, this a diplomatic dance. This has been good for decades now. And again, as I said, going back to the first part of your question about economic integration, and this we saw actually, and we've in fact probably discussed this before on your show. Just as Ukraine, the war in Ukraine demonstrated that globalization can be weaponized. Southeast Asia, the whole region fears that kind of weaponization will happen instantly in the case of any actual military action on Taiwan. As Emily was saying, half the planet's economy would tank immediately because of the semiconductor issue. And a lot of this is what the CHIPS Act was all about, which is another thing. America giving a shot in the arm to its own semiconductor industry to reduce its dependence. But as for the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia in particular is concerned, they do not want to be a victim of this kind of weaponization of globalization, or by intent or default, because anything bad happening to Taiwan will, let's face it, immediately. And as Emily said, it's a powerful argument against China doing anything rash on Taiwan, because China itself will suffer.
Yeah, no, that's hopefully the theory of economic interdependence leading to peaceful relationships. So hopefully applies in this case. On the other hand, Emily, it seems that Xi Jinping has really decided that the unification, he says as much, that the unification of Taiwan and the mainland is core to the identity of China and the future of China and the success of China, and in some ways are interpreting or seeing the Pelosi visit as a final step by the United States to deny that fundamental core reality by saying, no, really, there are two independent countries. And Pelosi's language was about defending democracy and freedom with everything we have. That was strong language that the Chinese might see as a real step towards recognizing China's, recognizing the independence of Taiwan from China. Is that, and therefore the confrontation is sort of inevitable. Is that the way Beijing is looking at it? Is the way we should look at it?
The fundamental problem is that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party apparatus he oversees is highly influential, but we have absolutely no insight into what their actual thinking is. So the different camps that viewed Nancy Pelosi's visit in both positive and negative terms often, I think, boil down to whether or not people think Xi Jinping has already made up his mind that he will take military action to officially unify Taiwan with China. If you think he's already made that decision and he is preparing the entire country to go for some kind of naval or aerial assault one day in Taiwan, then Nancy Pelosi visit was great because it's a show of allyship, of strength, and it shows that the US and maybe even Japan would come to Taiwan's defense if China ever invaded. But if you think that decision-making process is still ambiguous, that it's still being formed, and that Xi Jinping is viewing the world stage and trying to decide, is now a good time? Is it ever a good time for us to invade Taiwan? What might the consequences and costs be? If he's still kind of in that decision-making mode, then you don't want to do anything that might tip him into thinking there's more pressure than ever to invade Taiwan. And if he doesn't, he's going to look like a weak leader. And in that case, Pelosi's visit is seen as an escalation that was completely unnecessary. But the problem is that we just don't know what Xi Jinping is thinking. We don't know what his advisors are saying to him. Certainly, we've got to take some of his speeches at their word, that unification of Taiwan is important and core to the Chinese rejuvenation and all of that. But that could also mean a stricter formulation of one country, two systems, in which case Xi Jinping, unfortunately, has kind of nixed that by squashing democracy in Hong Kong. So if anything, this is China's doing, not the US's, and making the situation worse. But I just have no insight whatsoever in where the Communist Party is in its decision-making process. And therefore, we've got to game out exactly what we think might influence Xi Jinping's behavior.
I think that's brilliant, Emily, just setting up the two sort of schools and the sense on one side that decisions have been made, therefore we need to strengthen the capacity to prevent them from acting, and on the other side, let's not do anything to provoke them into a stance that otherwise will solidify. I think that rightly describes the debate in the United States in some ways and how the Pelosi visit was seen. James, I know you want to come in, but also talk a little bit about how the Europeans are trying to deal with this issue, because the reality is, yes, it may be one China, but it's two separate political and economic entities that are in fact, in many ways, increasingly diverging in perspective because of democracy in Taiwan and what's happening in China.
So I just wanted to pick up on a phrase that Emily just used, which I thought was brilliant and rarely honest for anyone who tries to cover China. That point about saying we have no insight into the thinking of the Chinese Communist Party. I remember at about this time every year, the news desk at the FT would call me and say, let's do a piece on Beidaihe. You know, the Chinese Communist leadership have gone to Beidaihe. This is where they're doing their summer thinking. It's a coastal resort. And
in these skimpy
no idea
that they walk around as leaders, right? Yeah,
the famous Mara suits. And the truth was that, of course, you had no idea. You had no idea really what was going on inside Zhongnanhai on a regular basis. But it's just worth pointing out that at no point in our adult lives have we been as out of touch with China as we are now. So the fact that a couple of years of effective lockdown means that there's not the cultural exchange, commercial exchange with people in China, means that there's much, much deeper misunderstanding. And so if you take one element of this conversation, which we've just touched on, Ivo, i.e. the economic element of retaliation, I think that we may be grossly underestimating the level of anxiety in the Chinese leadership about growth and unemployment. Now, that might stoke nationalist activity and symbolism, but it also might limit the party's range of action. And for the first time, I think, certainly in 30 years, China's supremacy economically is in question. I mean, not just in the region, I mean globally, that sense that China is on an inevitable march to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy, that is very much in question. And I think the Chinese will surely feel it. The Europeans look at all of this through a slightly different prism. Certainly in my country, in the UK, we do, which is, of course, Hong Kong. And the very clear sense that there's no deal to be done now. There is no version of one country, two systems, whereby you respect rights and laws in Hong Kong, even within the Greater People's Republic of China. There's no European support for that. So just to put in one word of support for Speaker Pelosi, given the consensus largely seems to be that it was an incendiary thing to have done, actually there is a community of people that thinks, looking back at what she did in the wake of Tiananmen Square, looking at what she did in Taiwan, actually there is a need for people to stand up and speak out. Otherwise, actually, those rights and laws are just encroached upon by Beijing.
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly a lot of people who, you know, as you say, Speaker Pelosi made her political career on the issue of human rights in China, unfurling a banner on Tiananmen Square in 1990 in support of the students and spearheading a lot of the legislative efforts to deal with human rights in China for a long time. Wasn't, by the way, a coincidence that the pantsuit she wore and the color she wore in the visit in Taiwan was the same as Hillary Clinton's when she gave her famous women's rights is human rights speech in 2005. She's been very consistent in that, and that, you know, to her credit, I think as the Speaker of the House, she is an independent person of an independent branch, and she decides to go to Taiwan. She's going to go to Taiwan, and no one is going to stop her. And trying won't help for sure. But so all those well taken. But there is still this sort of, a sense, and Nirmal jump in here, that perhaps this week did change the narrative. That even the economic problems that we're seeing inside Taiwan, inside China, because of zero COVID, frankly, because of a rapidly aging population, is leading to increased nationalism and a need for increased nationalism. The old adage that if you have problems at home, seek solutions abroad. This helped, and some of the social media that was coming out in Taiwan was critical of the government for not trying to shoot down Pelosi's plane or take even more significant action. Even if the Chinese government hasn't yet decided to use military means, isn't the spiral now looming in the wrong direction? And frankly, how do you get it back on course?
Yeah, nationalism is a sort of tiger on the leash, right? And unfortunately, when you release it or when you encourage it, you cannot control it, as we all know, and it's extremely dangerous. And the Chinese leadership, I think Xi Jinping and others have also made this point that this is the will of the Chinese people, the entire population of China, and so forth. And we should absolutely good point by Emily that we don't actually know what's going on in the inner sort of sanctums. But we have to take all this seriously. We have to take them at their word. This is all not just, you could call it chest thumping, but it's not necessarily bluffing. And it is something that could quite easily go completely out of control. Just as, again, because the Chinese system is so opaque, they know real public opinion polls and whatnot. You don't do the kind of thing. But if you compare to America, even here, President Biden risks being accused of being soft on China. So public opinion is a thing, both in China and in America. And if America, the leadership has to respond to that, then, China's not all that different. And I think it's generally perceived as a very dangerous path. Again, to my original point that the two powers are going on a very dangerous path. China is convinced that America wants to contain it. There is no real meaningful dialogue on any front at the moment. As you said, as I think it was James who said, climate is completely in doubt. That response is completely in doubt. So it's all very, very, it's not looking encouraging at all. The best thing, as per the region, would be that to continue the status quo and not let this get out of hand. And for that, you need to talk.
Yeah, and then that's those talks have just been cut off. But Nirmal, to your point, I think rightly, on the domestic politics in the United States, I gather that Pelosi and Biden did speak before she went, and she said to him, "If you tell me not to go, I won't go. But of course, I will have to explain why I'm not going." And so Biden didn't say, "Don't go," because he didn't want to be seen as the person who stopped her from going. And their domestic politics plays the escalating sort of sense that one has. Emily, finally, before we jump on to the next issue, I do want to have you comment on James's point on the economic problems that China is facing. You may not have exact insight into the thinking of the Communist Party, but you live there and to spend time there. Do you see the economic slowdown and the problems that China is facing as reinforcing the need for standing up tall abroad, and particularly with the issue like Taiwan, especially after what happened in Hong Kong just a year plus ago?
The economic problems are real. I don't know how important they are to the top leadership right now, because most of them are self-imposed. They have a lot to do with ongoing COVID lockdowns, which are really important for the party to maintain right now, because that's consistent with what they've kind of staked their reputation on over the last 3 years, the success of their anti-pandemic controls. Just anecdotally, I haven't been in China for the last 3 months, but particularly this year, the economic slowdown, the COVID controls felt much more severe than they had in 2020 and 2021. And just impressionistically talking to small vendors, I'm online a lot. So I look at, for example, and this is a hobby of mine, art auction websites and e-commerce sites and things like this. People are not getting sales. I've had a number of friends who are in advertisement who had to just close up shop because all of their contracts dried up in the last 2 years. Of course, this is on the consumer side. In terms of, fixed asset investment and building stuff, basically, China has not slowed that down that much. So the fundamentals are still relatively within control. And I just don't know how much the consumer hurt that people are going through on the lower to middle class level really matters that much, given that a lot of that pain is self-imposed. So I don't think that that's a push factor for China then to have to project its strength in a place like Taiwan, because that has not been caused by geopolitical frictions with the USA. It really has been a domestic issue for China.
I accept that you can blame the United States, if you can blame the United States for your economic problems, even though, of course, they're caused by the COVID lockdown, then you might be able to use that as a means for diverting attention from the economic ills. But we will see how it plays out. James, did you want to come in on this point, or shall we?
I just want to say I guess my point, Emily, and the reason why those anecdotes about what's happening on auction websites have become so valuable is, for most of the last 20 years, you'd have such an exchange of business people in and out of China, they'd have a feel for it. And so when the Communist Party came in and was unable to confirm that it was hitting the 5.5% growth number in the second quarter, when it became clear that the stats are talking about nearly 20% youth unemployment in certain places, what I feel more than ever is that we don't have that kind of on-the-ground sense of how much the economy is hurting and hurting real people. And to your point that it's a consequence of these latest lockdowns, it feels as though there is that, but there are also these big structural questions about China's capacity now for public investment to meet the failure of private demand, and also the party's control of tech investment, which also puts a crimp on future investment in the private sector. So all of which is to say, I'm really intrigued, and I wonder that given how much, frankly, news we've got in the United States, in Europe, that's consuming us, we're missing something about a fundamental change that's happening in China.
Emily, do you think of course, you're the one reporting on it, so hopefully we just need to listen more to NPR and your stories on it. I mean, there is too much news. There's no doubt about that. It'd be nice to have a little less news. And I think we, as I said before we got on the air, we may look back at this week in the last couple of weeks as really a turning point. And what happens in history is we often miss the turning point when it's turning, and we only look back at that. But it seems to me the solidification of both opinion in the United States and opinion in China on an issue that has beset the relationship since 1949 in one form or another, and the belief by many in the United States that China has made a decision to fundamentally change the status quo using military means, and the belief in China that the United States has fundamentally decided that for once it is going to recognize Taiwan as an independent entity, if not an independent state, is worrisome. If those two opinions and perspectives become the driving force of policy, we're going to be we're not going to get back to Nirmal status quo ante anytime soon, and that's bad for anyone. We only have a few minutes left. I thought it was very important we have this conversation here, because it's as I said, if we come back, at least we spend a half an hour talking about it, the turning point. But James, you know Kenya, you spent time there. There's an election on Tuesday. I think it's still too close to call, although the Vice President Rusto seems to be slightly ahead. But there's meaning behind this that goes beyond the specifics of what's happened in Kenya with regard to relatively and I'll underscore relatively low turnout in the sense that I think it's 65%, which is low for Kenya. But if only in the United States we had 65% turnout, we would have a much healthier democracy as it is. But it does raise questions about whether elections and democratic forms of government are still supported by the people who are supposed to be sovereign in these situations.
This might be a short trip into my night thoughts, Ivo. So forgive me if the connections seem a little weak. But in the UK, we are in the process of the Conservative Party membership choosing the next Prime Minister of the country. So that means 0.2% of the electorate is going to choose the next Prime Minister. This is eccentric, and when you start looking in the detail of who those people are and what the terms of their membership are, it gets mind-boggling, and you can't believe that a G7 country chooses its leader on that basis. As we've been looking this week at what the terms of membership are, Kenya went to the polls. And when the polls closed on Tuesday, and as you say, we don't yet know whether it's Raila Odinga or William Ruto, and the choice is really significant. But given we don't know, let's not make kind of sort of projections on that. What we did see was that when the polls closed, as you say, it was just over 50%, 56% at the time of closing. At the same time in 2017, 78% of Kenyans voted. And I think that, given we haven't mentioned it, that the biggest story in the world this week has been the FBI investigation of President Trump and what they did or didn't find in his home in Mar-a-Lago. When you put those three things together, when you put together signals of apathy amongst the electorate, particularly young voters in Kenya, a means of choosing a British Prime Minister that involves such a tiny proportion of the electorate, and a fundamental question about the integrity and probity of the former US president, and the pitching of the FBI against the president and all that entails, you have to stand back and think, the world that is not democratic will look at democracies and ask how much trouble they're in, whether it's from apathy or a sort of bizarre coda to the rules or a fundamental fight for its soul in the United States. And it feels to me as though Kenya is one of those moments where there's a signal here that the enthusiasm we saw, in the early 90s in Africa for a kind of wave of democracy, is it waning? And how worried should we be, given the other worries we've got, pandemics, globalization, climate, nuclear? How worried should we be that the early 2020s are also seeing a really concerted assault on public confidence in democracy?
That's a big thought, and obviously you're not sleeping very well at night, James, as a result. But but it is, it's one I share. And Emily, I think what's interesting, just to add to this, is that ideologically, the Chinese Communist Party and China, the Chinese leadership, has really tried to go on the offensive in the last few years against that kind of democracy. I mean, when Xi Jinping says the East is rising, the West is declining, he's in part saying our system is much better at providing for our people than that chaotic nonsense that is happening in the United States. And in some sense, it's taking hold in other countries. It's actually being quite received quite positively in other parts of the world. And so does China see an opening here, and that they can exploit our trouble here in democracy in the United States and the United Kingdom, two of the oldest democracies around the world, Kenya, where in fact violence is part of the electoral system, electoral politics as well, although there's no violence as yet, which is great. Is that how we should see this, that there's now an ideological competition, which since the end of the Cold War, we really haven't seen in the world?
Yes, I think it's an opportunity for China. And I think what's attractive about China as a partner, or at least a trading partner from some countries, is that it doesn't really have a cohesive ideology. So when China says our system is better than yours, that is a cogent argument that they've been trying to make. But they're not really pressuring other countries to then mimic the Chinese political system. Because to be honest, it's not very easy to simulate. It's also not very clear what that system is. I mean, clearly there's a Communist Party and there's a chairman who runs it, but it's not very clearly delineated. And as we have talked about before, it's a bit of a black box sometimes how provincial and national level communist bodies interact with one another and actually reach the decisions that they make. So this is not really an easily transmittable or even articulated model that China is trying to present to other countries. But what it has said basically is, we don't have a political model for you, but we will basically provide anything that you need and that's beneficial for us to sell. China says that this is an apolitical position. In theory, it is. I think many of us see that not having a political stance is often akin to having a political stance if you're aiding and abetting certain types of regimes. But that's China's message, and that's very, very appealing for some regimes that you or I might find undesirable.
And Nirmal, just as a last final point on this, just thinking about Southeast Asia, where in fact this tension is within ASEAN between not a communist and democratic system, but between more authoritarian and more democratic systems, and the question of the degree to which democracy is being diminished by looking around the world and countries saying, well, maybe we don't want what's happening in Burma, but it isn't clear that we want what's happening in countries like the United States and Great Britain.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the points that people like, I think Singapore's Prime Minister made this point as well in a speech quite recently, in which he said that most of Asia does not buy into this authoritarianism versus autocracy versus democracy argument, because Asia is very pluralistic. In fact, that pluralistic mindset enables, and of course the economic interdependency, enables Asia to deal with apparent paradoxes like the one China policy, right? They're comfortable with that. And you could say that ASEAN is comfortable with sweeping stuff under the carpet. It's 10 countries, it focuses on consensus. Yes, when something really extreme happens, when there's a coup in Burma and when there's a pogrom against the Rohingya, for example, yes, ASEAN does take a position and does make efforts. But that is only in extreme situations. Otherwise, it's like, let's just continue and try and manage these issues. So it is a mindset, really, in terms of the region. And one other quick point about the Mar-a-Lago raid. It also shows that that democracy, the accountability is part of the democratic process. I mean, there have been other vibrant democracies that are prosecuted. Trump is not being prosecuted, but there have been others who were prosecuted and jailed former leaders. South Korea has done it. India did it. So it is not something which is abnormal in any system.
No, the rule of law is in part about making sure that no one is above the law. That's a fundamental precept. If that is what makes democracy weak, in some ways it also makes seem to be weak. It actually makes democracy strong if you can live with it in one way or another.
And it is not to deny that democracy is in trouble in many places.
Well, unfortunately, it is, and that means that we have much more to talk about in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, I thought this was just a terrific conversation. I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh of the Straits Times, James Harding of Tortoise Media, and Emily Feng for joining us at a last minute. Really great insights, Emily from NPR. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.